Welcome back, EDU 250 friends. Thanks for your flexible thinking and willingness to watch this presentation online. There's a lot of good information, so I hope you sit down with a cup of joe. Listen, take some notes, and I hope that this inspires you as you get ready to work with kiddos with an autism spectrum disorder. This week, we're going to take a look at 3 more I can statements. We're going to cover the history and causes of autism, or at least what's currently known about possible causes. We're going to look at the identification of ASD within the state of Minnesota, since that's where you currently live and hopefully will teach one day. I'm going to share with you some of the accommodations and modifications for students who fall within the autism spectrum in their disability category. And then I'm also going to share some additional resources with you as well. So here's our 3 I cans. I can describe autism spectrum disorder and provide examples of syndromes included within this spectrum. I can describe criteria that must be met for a student to qualify for special education services at school under the disability category of ASD. And I can describe various accommodations and modifications that may increase the success of a student with autism spectrum disorder. So let's start with the first one. As you learned from your textbook, the S in the acronym ASD is really important. When we're talking about students with autism, there's a wide spectrum that's included. Autism Speaks, which is one of the great resources for you to use, defines autism this way. ASD is a group of complex disorders of brain development characterized in varying degrees by difficulties in social interaction, verbal and nonverbal communication, and repetitive behaviors. One of the questions I get asked most when I tell others that I'm a special ed teacher is, what's with all of the kids with autism these days? What's going on? I think it's important to understand that autism has been around for a long time, not just with the same prevalence or understanding. The word autism was initially used by a psychiatrist named Eugene Bleuler to describe one of his patients who was not only schizophrenic, but also very withdrawn and self-absorbed. The Greek word autos means self, and thus the word autism was born. In the 1940s, 2 pioneers in the world of autism were working on research, but as 2 independent parties. One lived in America and the other in Germany. The students with autism that Dr. Kanner, the American, was studying were severely affected and limited by their disability, while the students that Hans Asperger, the German, was studying were very intelligent and able-bodied, yet struggled socially. Interestingly, Hans Asperger's research was not translated into English until the 1980s, when autism research was finally gaining momentum in the United States. It was in the 1980s that research on autism gained full momentum. It was increasingly believed that parenting had no role in the cause of autism, and there were neurological disturbances and other genetic ailments that influenced the autism disability. In 1987, autism disorder was included in the DSM, which is an acronym that stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. You'll likely hear this acronym during IEP and evaluation meetings from your school psychologist. The 1987 edition of Autism Disorder included a checklist of diagnostic criteria. In this same year, parents started to find a hope in studies that were beginning to show that intensive behavior therapy could help children on the autism spectrum. Finally, in 1991, the federal government created a special education disability category specific to autism. In 1994, Asperger's syndrome was added to the DSM, which would widen the spectrum for students with autism, because in 2013, the DSM-5, which then was the most updated version, folded Asperger's syndrome into the ASD diagnosis. The DSM-5 defines ASD by 2 categories: impaired social communication and/or interaction, and restricted and/or repetitive behaviors. It's important for you to know that we actually have gone back to simply calling autism ASD. It's all part of a spectrum. We no longer use Asperger's as one definitive way of describing autism. It's all a spectrum, but it is two different distinct categories. One has to really do with that social communication and interaction. The other has to do with repetitive or restrictive behaviors. As I mentioned earlier, I'm often asked what's up with all of the autism I hear about these days. There's TV shows where a main character has autism, and every one of us knows somebody on the spectrum. So here's the facts that go with increased awareness of ASD. Take a few minutes and read this. While we don't know the exact cause of ASD, we do know some of the common factors for those who are on the spectrum. We know that brain scans show differences in shape and structure of the brain in children with autism compared to in neurotypical children. We also know that in families there appears to be a pattern, so there is definitely a genetic basis for some of these kiddos. So now that we've gone through what ASD is and how knowledge of it has developed, let's talk about how a student qualifies for special education services at school with this disability. Let's go through some of the ways a student on the autism spectrum might present themselves, as well as specific criteria that's required by the state of Minnesota. Before we move on, though, I want to clarify that the reason the words "at school" are in all capital letters here is because it's entirely possible for a student to be diagnosed with autism by their physician and to meet medical criteria of the DSM-5, but not to qualify for services according to educational criteria. We are going to go through the required educational criteria. As you look through this graphic, you'll see the 12 different ways that autism might present itself. And actually, there's way more than 12, but this is 12 that are most common. Keep in mind, these aren't the only ways, and that also a student who shows one or more of these isn't automatically autistic or on the spectrum somewhere. What's important to remember is that somebody who has autism often has a co-occurrence with one or more of the symptoms or diagnoses showed in the smaller circles here. Here's another graphic that I really enjoy, which shows some of the things that autism might look like from a teacher or parent perspective, as well as from the perspective of someone who has been diagnosed with ASD. Take a few minutes to read each one of these and note the differences in your head. You don't have to physically write them down, but between both views. And one final graphic that again shows some of the things that you might notice in someone who is on the autism spectrum. As with other disabilities, there's varying ASD criteria to qualify for education, medical, and community services. This can be really confusing. Sometimes parents will say, like I mentioned before, "My child has autism," and expect special education services to be a given because of something that their pediatrician has said. And while this medical diagnosis might mean that their child will receive special education services in the school setting, those services will only come as a result of qualifying for special education through the MDE pathway noted here. So if you follow that MDE pathway, the first step says a child must meet eligibility criteria for parts B and C. This is referring to IDEA criteria, that federal criteria. Part B addresses eligibility for kiddos ages 3 to 6, and Part C addresses eligibility for kiddos birth through age 2. The category diagnosis for MDE means that ASD is not always the best primary diagnosis for someone on the autism spectrum. In the educational world, It may actually be DD, developmental delay, or EBD, emotional and behavioral disorders. Or it may be that a special education category of ASD really is the best way to describe the student. As you look here at the Minnesota state criteria, you'll see that students must meet criteria in both sections A and B. And, like with all Minnesota criteria, to meet special education eligibility, the final decision is made by a team, of which you will be a part, and there is documentation to support the team decision. So we're on our third I can already. I can describe various accommodations and modifications that may increase the success of a student with autism spectrum disorder. So, once a child's determined to be eligible for special education services under the disability of ASD, what does that mean for you as a teacher? Well, here you go. I'll be quiet for a few moments here so you can read through some of the most common and successful accommodations and modifications for students on the autism spectrum. And here's a few more. Keep in mind that even without a diagnosis of autism, many of these are helpful for all students. It certainly doesn't hurt to put them into place in your classroom or in your gym. All right, because autism really is such a large spectrum, it's important to know where to look as a teacher for additional information. Above are some of the places that I've found online to be especially helpful. I'll add each of these links to our Classroom Moodle site as well. Take some time to bookmark them on your own computers or add them to your notes so that when the day comes and you have a student with ASD in your classroom, you can be well prepared. As we finish up for this week, take a few minutes as I read through the I can statements and reflect on what we've covered. If you don't feel confident starting any of these statements with the words I can, go back in this presentation or use the additional resources to gather the information you need. Here we go. I can describe autism spectrum disorder, ASD, and provide examples of syndromes included within this spectrum. I can describe criteria that must be met for a student to qualify for special education services at school under the disability category of ASD. And last, I can describe various accommodations and modifications that may increase the success of a student with autism spectrum disorders. As always, if you have any questions that are not covered in this presentation, just shoot me an email and I'll do my best to answer. Thanks for watching.